Welcome to everyone who has joined the meeting on behalf of the International Peace Bureau and our partners. We are very glad to have you with us today. We will now be formally starting our event for the day. The International Peace Bureau, for those of you who are not familiar with us and our work, we are an international nonprofit organization and international peace network with members in around 80 countries around the world, and individual members in more countries beyond that as well. So we're very happy to be working and collaborating with some close partners around the world for this series of Iraq Plus 20 events, which consists of 3 parts. We have some of the speakers who are joining us now, and without taking on too much time, I will pass the floor to our first speaker, Amir Amirani, who will give an introduction to some film clips from We Are Many and some further remarks to mark this day 20 years since the global protests against the US invasion of Iraq. Amir, the floor is to you.
Thank you, Sean. Firstly, I want to say thank you and hello to everyone. It's great to be here and to remember this day. So thank you for asking me to take part, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I was asked to say a few words about the film and how it came about. It took 9 years to make. I was on the protest on that day in Berlin. I had not actually, I think, been on a major protest of that scale, and it was an amazing thing to be a part of in Berlin. I live in London, and so when I came back to London, it was only then when I saw the reaction of people, my friends, but also people I'd never expected to take part in protests. Their excitement about it was a clue to me that something had changed and had shifted. I'd never seen anything like this amongst the people. The newspapers also kind of reflected that as well. And so it seemed to me that something had really radically changed in this country. And so it made me think that this was something that needed to be investigated and reported. I didn't know it would take me 9 years eventually to make the film from the time of starting to look at it in 2006 until when it was in cinemas in 2015. So it really was a need to tell the story of the largest protest in history, and to tell the story in a way from the bottom up, from that kind of point of view, which is something that I guess isn't really done that much. And also knew that you know, on the progressive side, maybe we've not been great about telling our own kind of stories. And so, you know, I love to hear what other people think about that, but that's certainly something that I thought was not going to be done by the mainstream media. And I, for one, thought it was a great story to tell. Now, I had no funding at all for this from any official sources. It was initially partly funded by crowdfunding, and then 9 separate individual backers. But absolutely every single organization and fund that I went to did not support the film. Now, it was eventually, after 9 years, in cinemas in the UK, but to this day, no television station in the UK or the US has shown the film, although Universal Pictures took the world rights to it and digital rights, and it is available on various platforms for people to see. Of course, it would be great if it was on television here and in America, the 2 protagonists of the war, but sadly that hasn't happened, and that may be something people might want to discuss, and why that's the case. The other things to say, I suppose that there's these clips that we're going to see that David Courtwright asked me to show. They really show the global nature of the protests, and I know we have some of the organizers. Leslie Kagan's here, from where I can see, who was instrumental in New York. So they show the demonstrations around the world. There's also a clip, I think, specifically about London, and there's clips that will be shown from Canada and also from London. So an initial one is kind of the global rundown, including Australia and the Far East and so on, and then specific clips from London, Canada, and New York. I mean, it's 20 years, it's an extraordinary thing to mark, to think that this was 20 years ago. I really look forward to the kind of discussions that we're going to have about if there are lessons to be drawn from that protest from these 20 years, what we can, I mean, I as a filmmaker can learn from organizers and what the organizers can have learned from their experiences from in the aftermath of that historic protest and where we are now. So I guess the last thing I want to say really is that it is extraordinary to me that despite that protest and the disaster that the wars have proven, the extraordinary and shocking loss of life, that there is absolutely no accountability for any of the perpetrators of that war. In fact, we see them frequently on television and in the media, for all the world as if nothing has happened. In the UK last year, they gave a knighthood to Tony Blair. I think so far in the US, they haven't gone quite as far as giving that sort of honor to George Bush, but hey, it's still early days, so anything can happen. So I guess really that's it, is to say that we're still living with the consequences, I think, of the war, and we will be for generations to come, or not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere. And I thank you for asking me to be a part of this, and I look forward to the discussions, and I hope you enjoy the clips. And if you want to see the full film, it's available out there. It's called We Are Many.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank Amir for this contribution. I had the privilege to see this footage before, and it really made me emotional. So it's a beautiful movie. I would encourage everybody to look for it, to support his work, support the work of filmmakers, of people who are bringing this word for all of us. Okay, and when we were preparing all this event, a friend of ours as well, he asked us to present also a little footage of a work that he did on the same theme. So his name is Leo Gabriel. He's part of the IPB family, and I'm here preparing just to show you as well a little footage of a documentary that he did that is called The Day Before. It's just a small excerpt, but also adds up to all the discussions and all the theme that we're going to have today in our event. Okay.
On the road back to Baghdad, where we are in the company of international peace activists, we encounter a group of people along the way. They left Samara a few days before.
The power of the war is a power of material destruction, but spiritual power of humanity, if united, it is infinite. That power may change. That is what we believe. We believe that miracle.
Food for thought. These activists have got the courage to risk their lives underneath the bombs that are about to hit Baghdad.
And I am here in Iraq in hopes of helping to stop this war, in hopes of helping people to understand that war is not the answer. It never was, it isn't now, and it never will be. And I only hope that my government will wake up and realize how unjust, how cruel, how undemocratic, how against human rights, how everything these actions of the United States are.
We arrive back to the city when the mosques call to the evening prayers.
I am Greek, born in Egypt, where I've been there for about 15 years. Then I came back to Greece, and I have very good feelings about our Arab people, and I maintained in all my life these links.
Did the fact that the Iraqi government is a dictatorship reflect during your visit?
From the one side, they are proud, they are against the war, they have the feeling that they are aggressed. From the other side, we have a sort of manipulation, because the war obliged them to be loyal, increasing the tension in the area. We are not helping the people to express what he feels and to find by his own means the solutions.
And what about these pictures of Saddam Hussein, the palaces and so on? Does that annoy you?
It remembers me the dictatorship in my country from 67 to 74. It's only 20 years ago, a dictatorship which has been planned, unfortunately, by the same state, United States, by the same country, and was supported by United States. And that's really, that makes me feeling that the actual aggression has nothing to do with democracy.
On the last weekend before the fatal X-Day, Iraqis gather across the land to protest against the war. It proves that the international peace movement has finally reached Iraq.
1, 2, 3, 4. We don't want your bloody war. Bush, Bush, we know you. Daddy was a killer too.
The demonstrators are accompanied by our delegation, which has been created within the framework of the World Social Forum, as well as by other peace activists who have determined to stay, whatever it costs. We all wanted to signal, shortly before the great battle, that another, more peaceful world is possible, and that there is no need for war.
Really touching footage from both of these documentaries. And for those who are interested, we will post again the names in the chat so you can look into them and explore them. But now we will move on to the next part of our program, in which we will hear from organizers of many of the protests from across the world 20 years ago, and they will explain a little bit of how the protests came to be and what the results as they see it in their context were. So Teo, as soon as you're prepared, please go ahead and show those videos.
Everyone, that's really a great memory and a good idea to remember what happened on this February 15, 20 years after. To me, it's, I think, one of the most beautiful memory I have from our fights. It's such a success, such a global feeling of we are all against the war, the world is against the war. I don't think I ever felt that since with such an emphasis. Mouvement de la Paix, the organization where I was active, the president at this point in time, was coordinator of the mobilization against the war in Iraq. We had started a very big coalition of all trade unions, all left organizations, and hundreds of associations. So I think we were something like 300, 400 organizations. Since September, 2002, and we organized demonstration each month. Then came November and the social forum in Florence. And I remember very well with Kate Hudson, Raffaella Bolini, and other friends from all over Europe. We had this little meeting and said we have to do something all together one similar day. And the idea of the 15th of February came. And this was followed by, I think, the the World Social Forum in January, where this idea was confirmed. Since then, in France, of course, the opinion was, I think, 85% opposed to the war. And on February 15, we started the demonstration, and all along the way it was already packed with people, and many people had come with buses from all over the country. They could not even get down of their buses because there were so many people. So it was just amazing. Whole country against the war, even the government, which is not very often happening. So yeah, that was, and we all thought that Bush had lost the war, even if he had not even started it. Then the movement, of course, went down when the war started. But I have kept this feeling of the unity and the strength of the unity to fight for peace. And I hope we can build against such big coalitions to protest all the war that are now. And of course, that we managed to find a way to unite against the war in Ukraine, and find a way to be all together one day, hopefully soon, all over the world against the war in Ukraine.
Once the call had gone out from the European Social Forum in Florence for a day of action to stop the war in Iraq, the movement in Britain did everything it could to mobilise. The crucial element was building alliances across civil society. We wanted to make sure that the demonstration reflected the level and diversity of opposition to attacking Iraq. 3 forces came together to organise the demonstration in London: the Stop the War Coalition, the Muslim Association of Britain, and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Between us and the many organisations that supported our call, we mobilised up to 2 million people in London that day. It was the biggest demonstration that had ever taken place in Britain. An important factor in our success was our determination to get the best possible route for our march and the best possible location for the rally. The establishment attempted in numerous ways to sideline the event, most notably trying to stop us ending the march in Hyde Park, and that was really the only venue large enough for us. They claimed it wasn't possible for us to walk on the grass there, but we refused to be deterred, and with political determination and huge backing, we were victorious. The weight of support across society meant they had to give way. Eventually, even mainstream newspapers were advertising the route of the march, and one even produced its own placards. The day was quite extraordinary, and quite right, it's gone down in history. I have many memories from that day, but my favourite is this. We had 2 marches heading to the park because there were so many people that one was not enough to get everyone there. I was on the front of one of them, and the moment when the 2 marches met at Piccadilly Circus and joined together for that final stretch, marching to the park, was just completely amazing. It really was unity in action. Yes, Tony Blair went ahead with his illegal war, but the political impact of that demonstration was felt for many years, eventually bringing him down. For some time, we understood ourselves as a second superpower. We understood the relationship between neoliberalism and war, and the essential role of international coordination and solidarity. And we saw that mass engagement can bring change. Since then, we have seen many attacks on our movement as the establishment has sought to destroy what was won. But we are fighting back. It is our responsibility to be united, to continue to learn the lessons of those days, and to continue the fight against neoliberalism and war.
February 15th was a child of the altermondialistic movement. In that movement, the idea was born, then promoted as the European Social Forum in Florence, and taken up globally at the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre. Without that global dynamic, a strong worldwide convergence of regions and thematics for a systemic alternative, February 15th would not be there. February 15th was also the result of the grafting of the altermondialistic movement with the strongest peace and anti-war traditions in the US, Italy, UK. Different experiences and cultures, but we got together without any difficulty around the common goal. And we succeeded because we used the methodology of the movement. First, alliances. Nobody could do it alone. We needed each other. It was a fast building of mutual trust. Second, a strong and clear and very short platform, which in a few lines expressed the greatest possible consensus, leaving all the differences out. And last but not least, no leaders, no competition for power and visibility, all together in a collective work. And the result was the mobilization of everyone. The no war and the peace movements, secular and religious cultures, anti-imperialist and non-violent groups all together. One of the challenges was that many months before, we had to choose a day. We were in need to demonstrate before the beginning of the war, and we could not predict it. I remember very well the moment where we took the risk and we told each other, let's go, February 15th. There were 3 million of people in Rome, the largest demonstration in the world. It was supposed to be one march, but in every street we found in front of us, behind us, around us, large self-organized marches of people coming from all sides. We were too many, an endless tide of people. We did not stop the war, but we did crucially undermine the consensus to war, to the Iraqi war and to the following ones. Even today, the majority of the Italian people are in favor of an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine. And we gave strength and hope in Iraq and in the Middle East to independent civil society. In the following years, often in dramatical situations and by paying a very high price, they made a great part for affirming democracy, peace, and social justice.
The organizing for February 15th in the U.S. got underway right after the new year. United for Peace and Justice, a nationwide anti-war coalition that had formed less than half a year before, issued a call for a mass mobilization in New York City with actions throughout the country that same weekend. In New York, we ran into a major obstacle as city officials and the U.S. government tried to stop our protests, the first major protest since 9/11 from happening at all. We did not win what we wanted and settled for only having a rally close to the UN. With just 7 weeks of organizing in the heart of our winter, we were not sure what the turnout would be. We knew it would be big, but we wouldn't know until that day how big. Impossible to know for sure. Our best estimate was that at least 500,000 people came out in New York City on February 15th. The sight of a rally was overwhelming. It was overflowing. From the stage on First Avenue, we saw people filling the very wide street for almost a mile. And that did not include the people stuck on the side streets and up and down Second and Third Avenues, all hoping to get into the rally area. With speakers and performers from many communities and constituencies, some well-known, others speaking at a rally for the first time, the point was made over and again throughout the afternoon. The U.S. plans to launch its war against Iraq was based on lies. We, the people of this country, working with our sisters and brothers in an international anti-war movement would do everything we could to prevent this war from starting. As the day went on and we heard reports of the massive turnouts in Europe and the rest of the world, a sense of hope, of possibility took hold. The New York Times was announcing that there were now 2 superpowers on the planet, the United States and worldwide public opinion. Stopping the war machine, the U.S. war machine, proved impossible. But our protest was not in vain. February 15th roused people to stay active, to keep working for peace, to not be deterred by the forces of war. Our work is far from over. Thank you.
Greetings from the Philippines, Judy Ann Miranda, Secretary General, Partido Manggagawa. The Partido Manggagawa Labour Party Philippines joins the commemoration of the historic worldwide protests against Iraq War and gives salute to all activists, movements, and organizations who advocate against war and exploitation. Wars mainly serve the expansionist agenda of imperialist nations, not the economic need of the oppressed, jobless, and hungry people. The Ukrainians, Palestinians, Iraqis, Afghans, the Africans, Asians, Europeans, or the world's peoples had had enough of wars. Amid the crisis, workers and poor people need no tanks and missiles, but land and factories to work, not bullets but food, not destructive arms but public goods. 20 years ago, through the strong unity and clamor of the people of the world, we have showed their collective strength to protest against a superpower. The Philippine labor movement is proud to be part of this historic moment. Caught in the crossfire is Angelo de la Cruz, an overseas Filipino worker in Iraq, was taken hostage by the Iraqi Islamic Army Al-Walid Corps and threatened with beheading if the Philippine government did not withdraw its troops from Iraq. Angelo was one of more than 1 million Filipinos who work in the Middle East as overseas Filipino workers. The release of Angelo was hard-won through street protests and concerted actions of Filipinos, and the consequent withdrawal of the Philippines from its membership in the Coalition of the Willing is a triumph of the Filipino people and a much-needed opening to review Philippine foreign policy. The United States was dismayed by the decision of its former colony, and media reported the pullout of Philippine troops as essentially one more blow to the big headache of the U.S. This is a victory for the people of the world that one more country has pulled its troops out of the U.S. immoral and illegal war of conquest in Iraq. With the prospect of more wars coming as a global recession and the fight for markets gets more intense, the old reality remains. These wars are not ours. We have always viewed war as an extension of imperial politics. There were trade wars and oil wars, and behind all of them are imperialist powers. The working class has its war, the war against exploitation, poverty, and climate crisis. These are the wars that we need to wage within our own countries and in solidarity with others, rather than us serving as production and foot soldiers in wars that were never ours. War has always been an instrument of plunder and exploitation. War is barbarism, which is even harsher than a pandemic, and the only antidote to it is resistance. We must raise consciousness, organize, and struggle for socialism. Stop the atrocities of war on women and children. No to war, no to exploitation. Judy Ann Miranda, Secretary General, Partido Manggagawa, February 2023.
February the 15th was a momentous day, and one I will never forget. The protests rolled around the globe in sync with the sun. And in Britain, we woke up to hear that Australia had its biggest demonstrations ever, including 500,000 in Sydney. And this set the pattern. Country after country recorded record-breaking demonstrations. Later estimates suggested 30 million people marched around the world. I suggest that it was probably more than that, given the sheer number of protests in cities, in towns, even in villages that we know about. In London, we had to organise 2 assembly points because there was going to be so many people there. And I remember a deeply emotional moment towards the start of the day when the 2 marches met at the Statue of Eros in Piccadilly Circus in the West End of London. And that was the moment when we realised that something extraordinary had happened and that we were moving into new political territory, to be honest. And the demonstration ended up being kind of human wave of people moving across the city from east to west. On the Monday after the demonstrations, the New York Times carried an article which I think expressed the historic nature of the day, saying that perhaps now there were once again two superpowers, the US on the one hand and world public opinion on the other. We didn't stop the war, but in Britain, certainly we came closer than we knew at the time to stopping the participation of our country. Tony Blair admitted in his memoirs that the sheer scale of opposition had led him to think that he was finished. And our Defence Secretary at the time, Jeff Hoon, phoned his opposite number, Donald Rumsfeld, in the US 8 days before the war, saying that Britain may well not be able to participate. What we did as well is to generate a majority anti-war feeling, not just in Britain, but right across Europe, in the US, in the heartlands of imperialism. And this is a major achievement and something that I think is extremely precious. And I think it's the reason why February the 15th continues to reverberate. Politicians and commentators and military figures on both sides of the Atlantic admit to this day that domestic public opinion is constraining their policy. It makes it very hard for them to put tens of thousands of boots on the ground in a foreign war, as they did in Iraq. And I think this is one of the factors that shaped post-Iraq imperial policy, with its emphasis on drone wars, air wars, secret operations, and war by proxy. I also think this is part of the significance of the West's Ukraine policy. They are so enthusiastic in the US and in Britain and in other countries. They're so enthusiastic about the escalation because it is a conflict that can be presented as a simple response to brutal Russian invasion. Now, the anti-war movement has stood against the Russian invasion, has called for Russian troops out from the start. But we have to be clear, once again, a Western war policy is being dressed up in the language of liberation, and that it's really about power projection, and that it's taking us to the brink of disaster. Once again, we need to be mobilizing against war internationally and at scale.
Hi everyone, my name is Winifred Lewis. I'm a peace activist and a scholar of peace activism. And I was at the Brisbane 2003 rallies 20 years ago. I interviewed Annette Bramley, one of the co-organizers.
The organizing for the February rallies sort of really only took off about 3 months before the war was initiated. It really developed on the back of protests that happened post 9/11, when people around the world, I think, knew that the attack on the United States territory was going to lead to another US-led war or more US-led wars. So we had a number of demonstrations and events, particularly a big one on the anniversary. We went with the slogan of "Our grief is not a cry for war." And it was quite a diverse representation in the coalition of groups that came together. This was then followed by the leadership of the Lord Mayor of Brisbane, a city of 1 million people, who organised with us to set up the Queensland Peace Network. So again, that was a diverse group of people. Just Peace, the local group that I was in, played a leadership role in setting up the Queensland Peace Network. Almost 100,000 people, somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people came out on the streets that day in Brisbane. Yeah, they were huge, really, in the sense that people who'd never marched before were on the streets that day. And in the lead up to the day, I was getting phone calls from people just throughout the community. And again, that's the input of the media highlighting and talking about the protest. And I remember waiting, as I was early at the venue, waiting for the maybe 5,000 people might come. We had a strong feeling about it. And then the people just poured in. It was quite amazing. Yeah, people couldn't get on trains. The trains were packed. And, you know, by the time the march finished at its end destination, there were still people arriving at the site where people gathered. Yeah.
Sadly for Annette and for me and those of us who were at the rallies, in the end, they didn't work. Australia was one of only 4 countries that joined the Coalition of the Willing. The final output of the rallies, many years of war and millions of people whose lives were devastated Diverse coalition is sustained to this day in other peace movements like the International Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons and the Movement for an Independent and Peaceful Australia.
The international protests of the 15th of February 2003 were unprecedented not only in terms of the size of the demonstrations, but also in terms of an international coordination. The Global Day of Action was only possible because it was planned by an international network of social movements. After US President George W. Bush's first declaration of war before the United Nations General Assembly on 12th of September 2002, anti-war groups organized public protests worldwide. It was the time when we organized the first European Social Forum with activists from trade unions, the peace movements, and other social initiatives. This took place from the 6th to the 10th of November 2002 under the motto, "Another Europe is possible," with 50,000 registered participants in Florence, Italy. At the conclusion of the ESF in November 2002, the proposal to official call to demonstrations across Europe on 15th February 2003 was accepted. This call was fleshed out at a planning meeting in Copenhagen in December. The anti-Iraq war movement has gathered extraordinarily strong moments in the weeks leading up to the February demonstration. Nevertheless, we are surprised by the response to the international appeal. An orderly demonstration could not take place in view of the crowded streets for the final rally at the Siegessäule, the Victoria Column in Berlin. Coaches brought people from over 300 German cities to Berlin to take part in a demonstration of 500,000 people, the largest demonstration including members of Chancellor Gerhard Schröder's government that had taken place in Berlin for decades. The breadth of the demonstration reached more people than even the anti-nuclear missiles marches of the 1980s. 20 years after the overwhelming mass protest from 2003, the question remains, what can and must we learn from this day? What might already be history? What will remain alive? 15 million worldwide against an announced war on the streets in one day around the globe. The demonstrations were particularly massive where the government supported the course of the US government most massively. Madrid, Barcelona, London, Rome, each saw at least 1 million people on their feet. And yet it was not possible to prevent those in favor of war from disregarding international law and the will of the majority in many countries and not attacking Iraq. In my opinion, it was important that the European anti-war movements now succeed in continuing their cooperation in this longer term and in directing the focus on the European aspirations for power as well as on the American one.
So we extend a sincere thank you to all of those who were organizing the protest 20 years ago. Of course, we only included a portion of all of those countries in this last segment. We would have been happy to have many more, but due to time and geographical constraints, we're happy we could do that. And we had really insightful comments from these speakers, which will be addressed also in our following sections in more detail. I see there are also a few questions already in the Q&A section, and I believe those will also be answered in the coming sections. Without further ado, we move to the next part of our program, which is an interview conducted by Kathy Kelly, who is the president of the Board of World Beyond War, and she will be interviewing Ismail Dawood, who is an Iraqi human rights defender who has been working intensively in the past years to promote and monitor human rights and building democracy in Iraq. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be with you, and this certainly has been an impressive rallying of these spirits that so moved people on February 15th during all of those many, many demonstrations. And when I first met Ismail Dawood, I thought, well, what incredible courage. It was a post-war time in a way. And there he was doing his very best to build up civil society after it had been battered and bludgeoned, really, by so many militarists and other kinds of war powers waged against them. So Ismail, thank you for being with us today. Could you first just tell us where you are and say a bit more about what you're doing in Pisa, Italy now?
Thanks a lot, Kathy, and I would like really to thank all the organizers of this great event. It's really very important to see ourselves here together with the organizers of the biggest protests against the war. We need this, let's say, continued work against this logic of using war for a political change. So I'm still an activist, human rights and activist for Iraq. I'm working together with colleagues in the Iraqi Civil Society Solidarity Initiative with the Iraqi alternative civil society that have been struggling after the war to build a real democracy. I'm based now in Italy, so we also will have an event here in Rome about the same topic, and we're gonna, let's say, discuss also how to bring forward this, let's say, initiatives of mobilizing people for peace.
So, Ismail, I remember that there actually was a demonstration in Baghdad going down Sharia Abu Nuwas, and our group with Voices in the Wilderness was part of that. It was a small demonstration, but the reason we were there for many years, from 1996 until 2003, was because we wanted to break the economic sanctions. And we felt that, really a war was being waged, an economic war against Iraq for a long time. Can you comment on the situation that you experienced in Iraq before the shock and awe bombing began?
Yes, so actually Iraq was having a very hard time because you see a country that was very well organized in terms of services, infrastructure, institutions, and these have been all destroyed by the first war of 1991, and then the economical sanctions and the continuous bombing, because Iraq was living actually, even before the war 2003, a state of no war, no peace, because it was bombarded every 2 or 3 years, according to the decisions of US administration at that time. So Iraqis were seeing drastically how dramatically services and structures are destroyed because of these sanctions. So health sector that is going down, education, that was one of the first quality of education in the Middle East, environment, cultural heritage, and how, let's say, Iraq is going to a deep, let's say, era of an effect of war and continuous sanctions, let's say.
I remember a woman saying to me, she was a young mother, she said, "We now feel like if there's a light at the end of the tunnel, it's a locomotive coming toward us." Can you recall, Ismail, well, thank you, but just maybe help us understand more about what the impact of the bombing was on your city of Baghdad, as you recall it?
Well, it's really, the destruction was everywhere. I mean, I see a lot of similarity of what we are seeing, by the way, now in Ukraine. I mean, civilians are trying to, let's say, avoid to be a target. Infrastructures around them bombarded because of, claims from two parts that this was being used as a military target or not, but that does mean nothing for civilians who are living there, trying to avoid to be bombarded or get killed because of this nonsense of war coming from huge power. There was also, let's say, the end of, we were seeing, and we are still seeing actually, the end of a monopoly of the state over weapons, because since that time till today, there was a period of demonstrating that weapons have been distributed to various groups. Armed groups have been mushrooming since that time. So the states have been destroyed, and institutions are not there anymore. So that was like a very harsh result of this that war, 2003 war. That is, the consequences are still ongoing, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And could you say anything about how the war impacted you personally, Ismail?
So as hundreds of thousands and millions of Iraqis, it was, let's say, changed life from being, you know, a normal people living in their city and house to some that were obliged to leave their house because of the direct impact of war, or like me, activists who were after the, let's say, the state lost the monopoly of the control over weapons. So militias everywhere, so they just left the country because it was not possible to live there anymore. I mean, it's let's say, a story of changing the normal life by what we are seeing again in any war, like the war in Ukraine is an example. It's repeating, to me, it's repeating what we were seeing there.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there's a lot of media coverage of what's happening in Ukraine, but I don't recall that kind of media coverage with that sort of empathy with regard to what you experienced. And I know that there was loss of life that you experienced following the occupation when those militias started to burgeon. And so our heartfelt sorrow, but knowing that you rolled up your sleeves and determined to try to build a safer space for Iraqis has always been impressive. Do you see anyone, any group that benefited from the war, whether economically or corporately?
So directly after the war, we were seeing by our eyes in Iraq that war contractors and service providers for military and weapon producers were the first, let's say, group of people who have been benefiting from this war. It was the first war that lots of private companies are going part of the machine of waging the war. And actually, again, similarity with what's happening in Ukraine. Wagner Group is not so different of the private military companies that we heard for the first time in Iraq, like, I don't know, Blackwater or G4S. These were unknown for us in Iraq. We knew them only after the war. Especially also the multinational companies that were, let's say, having very, very limited role in petrol and gas in Iraq. Now they own the petrol and gas of Iraq. That's a reality. And it's like this for I don't know, for how many years in the future, because the public sector that was destroyed have been filled by the multinational companies, and actually the economy that was providing a kind of protection for small industry have been destroyed and left, and the economical system have been changed totally. So like Iraq becomes a country that imports everything, no private or public industry, increase economic and food dependence of Iraq. So I see all of those who are gaining of this situation as benefiting from the war, actually. So that's how we see it in Iraq.
And okay, so some have suggested that the United States wanted to communicate to every other country in the world, if you do not subordinate yourselves to fulfill US national interests, this is what can happen to you. Witness what happened in Iraq. Others have said, well, the United States wanted to control the pricing and the flow of energy resources. In your reflections, Ismail, and discussions with others, why do you think this wreckage was visited upon your country? Why was this done to you?
So I really believe that Bush administration was bringing to the region they call it the new or the big Middle East project, which means an intervention that redesigned the region to protect or to gain more benefits, economical benefits and political benefits. That was a historical moment where the Bush administration decided that they need to have more presence and reorganize. It's really, that's what was like behind this idea of war. And they said it, they have said it before, the control of petrol and gas, and also the way that this petrol and gas is pumped from the region towards Europe or to the world was part of it, a major part of it, but also redesigning the geopolitical situation of the Middle East was part of this, this project. There have been created some zones to pull in extremists. Afghanistan was not enough, and Iraq have been used like this. That's why we have seen, for example, with the arrival of military, US military and coalition forces, of course, mainly US military, that there were military bases very well protected, then the cows everywhere. And extremist militia groups, cows everywhere, while the army was protecting itself in small military bases behind T-walls that we start to know after 2003. T-walls became a phenomenon, mushrooming every street in Baghdad, in Iraq, and all over Iraq. That was, let's say, what Condoleezza Rice was describing, you know, the new project of new Middle East or greater Middle East or bigger Middle East, or what they were calling it like a creative chaos, or all these crazy ideas that is now not on the table. I think Bush administration have believed in, and of course, controlling of petrol and gas, and the way that this petrol and gas is pumped or exported to Europe or the world.
You know, it was already mentioned earlier that the world came closer than ever before to stopping a war before it started. And, you know, if the International Atomic Energy Association had been able to issue a report saying, we don't see any weapons of mass destruction, you know, we've done the research, but I guess there was some panicked fear in capitals around the world that maybe that report would come out. And of course, Colin Powell had already made an entirely fraudulent declaration that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Do you have any thoughts, Ismail, about this remarkable wave around the world of protest, which, you know, we've all had to say did not prevent the war, but it came close? Have you any thoughts about, you know, that intersection, if you will, between what actually happened and what we had thought might happen?
Yeah, we had also the feeling that there was we were very close. There was a step missing, maybe, you know, being ready to something, to the next step. It could be organizing differently this power, this massive power, bringing it to a general strike, bringing it to attack and other technical non-violent techniques, like and that was, I think, was a bit missing. However, we feel like all what the alternative civil society in Iraq have built during these years was the legitimate son of this protest, international protests, because we use the same techniques. So we were depending on auto-organization, non-violent techniques, networking and alliances. And for example, the 2019 uprising in Iraq, Teshrin uprising in Iraq, was using these techniques. Youth were occupying squares and streets in Baghdad, saying to the sectarian regime that was installed after the occupation, and actually this is one of the major problems that the occupation created in Iraq, the sectarian regime that had been installed since 2003. You start to hear about Sunni, Shia, Kurd, never about Iraqis. And that's the most, let's say, powerful weapon that have been used against Iraqis. And Iraqis are struggling till today. The 2019 protest was calling for an Iraqi identity and of a sectarian regime using the same, very similar techniques. And it's not by chance that Iraqis decided to establish an Iraqi social forum and a protest every 2 years against this, let's say, ongoing crisis. So I think that what we learned is a lot. What we learned is really a lot. And there is a continuous need of this, maintaining this struggle together. I mean, the risk of having war as a political mean to create a change, it's still there. Actually, it's becoming more dangerous because now that we are hearing about new countries and states following the US model. Russia aggression against Ukraine, Turkish aggression when they want and when they decide against Syria, Arab Emirates producing armies, China accumulating armies, Turkey and Iran exporting armies during this during this war. So producing arms and exporting arms is following the same model. If you have arms, then you can have your own political project and you can influence geopolitics. And this is something that we need to stop against. And I think this movement and anti-war movement need to rethink and need to reorganize according to this. That this is not only about Iraq, Ukraine, it's about, and not only about the aggression led by Bush administration. It's all about war as a political tool that are in the hands of the powerful countries used against other states.
Ismail Dawood, I want to thank you for all of the insights you've given us this morning and for the future that we will enjoy of continuing to hear from you. Thank you, Ismail. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you. Thanks a lot. I will need to leave to go to Rome event, but I will follow also the rest of this meeting if it will be registered. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Kathy and Ismail. Really a very insightful interview. So we thank you for your contributions here. As has been written in the chat, we are just a little bit behind schedule, but we're going to move right along to our next section, the roundtable on the impact of the Iraq War and the anti-war movement 20 years ago through till today. We will start this segment with a video from U.S. Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who was the only member of Congress in the U.S. to vote against the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, and also helped to form a coalition of men and women who voted against the invasion of Iraq. So we'll have her video, and then immediately afterwards, the floor will be to Leslie, our moderator for the panel.
Hello, I'm Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and I represent California's beautiful 12th Congressional District, which includes Oakland, Berkeley, and parts of the East Bay in Northern California. I'm so pleased to be with you all today to commemorate your 2 decades of anti-war activism. 20 years ago, I opposed the Iraq War because I felt, and I knew then, it was built on a lie of weapons of mass destruction. You all share that understanding with me, and I'm grateful for our partnership to oppose militarism and war in the years since. 3 presidents have come and gone since Congress last voted to authorize the United States invasion of Iraq over 20 years ago, with the 4th now in office. Yet the legacy of these horrific forever wars live on in the form of the now obsolete authorization for use of military force resolutions. Just last week, I reintroduced once again legislation to repeal the 2002 AUMF alongside Representative Chip Roy, Abigail Spanberger, and Tom Cole, with Senators Tim Kaine and Todd Young leading the effort in the Senate. It's far past time we restore our constitutionally protected congressional war powers in a bipartisan fashion. Military action should be debated by the people's representatives in Congress as the Constitution intended, not unilaterally decided by any president without consultation. It's time we democratize our foreign policy and invest in diplomacy, development, and the needs of people before we exercise the military option, which is always there. 20 years on, this has been a bipartisan, bicameral effort. And with your help, we are going to get these AUMFs repealed this year and finally put an end to our forever wars. Thank you so much. Let's keep up.
Well, thank you. I'm so happy to be here, with you all today, 20 years later. Many of us have a head of gray hair at this point, but we know that our movement, the anti-war movement, is in some understandings we are not as strong as we would like to be. We haven't given up, and I just want to add my welcome to those of you who are tuning in, and I'm hopeful that this event today will do something toward regenerating even more activism and an even deeper commitment to the ongoing work. What we want to do for the next half hour is have a brief conversation with three other people who were all involved in organizing and helping to build 20 years ago the historic demonstration that we commemorate today, and probably even more importantly, have all been involved for many years before and since then, understanding that one day, even as magnificent and as powerful as February 15th was 20 years ago, one day doesn't do all the work that needs to be done. So we want to look at what happened 20 years ago in relation to the ongoing work of our anti-war movement, both in our host countries where we live, in our regions of the world, and as a global phenomenon, the anti-war movement. So I want to quickly introduce the three people who are with me today, and then each of them will say a few opening words, and we have a few questions to bounce back and forth on. First is Rentner Braun, who was the former director of the International Peace Bureau for many years. He helped organize the tremendous march demonstration in Germany 20 years ago. And today he often speaks on subjects ranging from NATO and the militarization of Europe to military spending and the responsibility of scientists in these times. Second, we have Jeremy Corbyn from England, who had served as the leader of the opposition and the leader of the Labour Party from 2015 to 2020. He is a member of he's a British member of Parliament and founder of Peace and Justice Project. And then third, last but not least, is Anuruddha Chenoy, a retired professor from, I hope I pronounce this correctly, Jawaharlal Nehru University. I probably botched that, sorry, who writes widely and is closely engaged with peace groups around across Asia. So why don't we start with you, Renner? Again, a brief opening, few sentences or so about 20 years ago, reflecting on that, the meaning for today.
Thank you, Leslie. And please allow me also to say one personal sentence. for me, this February 15, 2003 was one of the greatest days in my peace life. When I was coming to the rally very early in the morning, I could not expect what happened during the day. You know, I was on the stage and the TV, which make a direct report of that day, asked me if I can come to that TV room, and they showed me the different parts of Berlin. And the whole Berlin was totally overcrowded by protesters. I never saw this, and maybe never again. So it was a great day by the quality and the quantity of the people. We had the hugest and broadest coalition. But, you know, lessons learned. And I really would like to say one sentence to Barbara Lee, because it's the sentence of today. This is the courage to say, as the only person no in the House, this was a big, big steps. And you need courageous to do it. And today, in this opposition against the Ukrainian war, with these hateful speeches in media and politicians, you again need courage to be active against the war. And I'm happy that we can say that the peace movement is still active against the war in Ukraine. We criticize the illegal attack of Russia, but we know that only negotiations and ceasefire are the way out of these crises. And you know, we are in Berlin, we'll have on the 25th of February a big demonstrations. It will not so big like the demonstration in Italy some weeks ago, but it will be also a sign of hope. And I think peace movement always is a sign of hope. Politically, I think we should remember what's happened politically at that time. We had a peace coalition of governments. This was France, Germany, and Russia. And today we see that NATO and the United States destroyed totally this coalition, which is not a coalition of peace, but which is an alternative for the permanent going to war and destroying of countries and governments. So, and I think what is absolutely needed is, again, this coalition of peace under the umbrella of common security. And this is, for me, one lesson from that time till to today. The next point I really would like to mention, and this also shows that for me, the Ukrainian war, the picture for this Ukrainian war, which Russia was following, is also a little bit the behavior of the US in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Because the equality, they don't care about human rights, they don't care about international law, and they are always using this horrible story of double standards. And I think as peace movement, we deeply have to criticize the double standards. Last point I would say is the engagement. You know, we all are 20 years older, and we don't make the generation change. So we need a new generation of peace activists, and our job is to open this generation to come to the stage and to be the protest actions who hopefully will organize the next 15th of February 2032 or 28.
Thank you. Jeremy, you're on.
Thanks, Leslie, and pleasure to be here on this call. And like Rainer and yourself, wonderful to see Barbara Lee on, who stood absolutely alone in Congress in 2001. And she's stayed the course ever since. And it's wonderful to have her on and to know her as such a wonderful person that she is. And thank you for the great event we've just held and those amazing speeches that have been made. 20 years ago, that massive demonstration in London, it's still the biggest ever demonstration in British history. I remember it so well, standing there on the stage and just seeing 1 million people and more, young, old, black, white, all together, people that had been on demonstrations for years, people that had never been on a demonstration, that coming together, and they're all looking at the stage, wanting their participation to stop the carnage in Iraq that was being planned at that very moment by Britain, the USA, and others. And it did provoke a rebellion of 150 Labour MPs against the war in Iraq, but that sadly was not enough, and Britain went to war on Iraq. I spoke that day, and my message was very simple. If we let slip the dogs of war today and go to war in Iraq, it will create the terrorism of tomorrow, the poverty of tomorrow, the wars of tomorrow, and the refugee flows of tomorrow, because that is what wars do. Sadly, where was I wrong? The wars in Libya, the wars in Syria, the war in Ukraine, and so on, as well as the terrorist threats and the refugees that are all over Europe and all over the world. I was in Calais 3 weeks ago talking to desperate people from Afghanistan, from Libya, from Syria, and so many places, being harassed by the police, being beaten by racists on the streets, just looking for a place of safety. What has happened to our humanity across this continent, across the world, that we see unarmed, desperate refugees as somehow or other an enemy? And there was a refugee hostel set on fire in Britain last week, and I'll be in Liverpool this Saturday, standing with the refugees against the hate that's being promoted. No, we didn't stop the war in Iraq. Obviously, we know what's happened in Iraq, and Julian Assange, who is now in a maximum security prison for telling the truth about Iraq, about the cynical way in which commanders instructed pilots to kill innocent civilians on the streets of Iraq and indeed in other places during conflicts. Had we succeeded that day in preventing my country being involved, others being involved, and the invasion not going ahead on the lie that there were weapons of mass destruction, the world would be a different, better, and much safer place. And I feel akin to those that assembled in Berlin and London and Paris in 1914 to oppose the First World War. They paid the price. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were killed. Juarez was killed in France, and Keir Hardie died of a broken heart, literally, had a heart attack and died, the leaders of the anti-war movement. That was the anti-war movement that said, workers shall not take up arms against workers. And that message still applies today. So what are the lessons of this? That we have to educate, we have to mobilize, and sometimes you have to be brave and stand up against the mainstream. The war in Ukraine has taken tens of thousands of lives already, of Ukrainian soldiers, of Ukrainian civilians, of Russian soldiers who've been conscripted into the army. It has damaged the lives of many more and is in danger of getting worse and worse. There has to be a peace process. There has to be a call for peace. There has to be a world which isn't made ready for the profits of the warmongers and the arms industry, but made ready to help the victims of war, the victims of the environmental crisis and the refugees. Our roundtable today, I think, needs to be positive, look forward to the future, and mobilize people.
Thank you. Okay. Anu, you're up.
Thank you. I'm deeply honored to be here, and it was wonderful to listen to everyone, to be on this panel with old friend Jeremy and Rainer. What I'm going to do is speak on what happened in the Global South and give an overview of that. Now, this war and aggression on Iraq for the entire Middle East, it was the biggest shock since the creation of Israel. There was unprecedented anger, mass protests under emergency laws in Egypt, Yemen, Jordan, and in the police states of that time, Syria and Tunisia. Similarly, in other parts, Turkey, huge demonstrations. And these were not really peace movements as you see them in Europe, because in a lot of the Global South, peace movements are fragmented and they cannot have that kind of mass mobilization as religious or social movements do. So these protests were really mass anger and mass, ordinary people on the streets. In Malaysia, for example, there was again and again repeated people on the streets were 200,000 on one day. Similarly, in India, there was, on the one hand, there was peace demonstrations led by the small peace movements we have, but a Gallup poll on February 3rd showed that, and this Gallup poll was across many places in the global South. It found that in India, 93% of the Indians surveyed were against military intervention. In Pakistan, 60% of the people. Argentina, 83% people. South Africa, 63%. Russia, 59%, and the US, 21%. So it was a worldwide opposition to a unilateral attack. That is, 80% of people polled by Gallup poll and in another poll found these figures. Now, I also want to, the non-aligned movement of 112 nations collectively denounced the war and asked for immediate peace. The Organization of Islamic States opposed this war. And I want to also now tell you what was the impact of these mass protests on our regimes, which very often do not hear what citizens are saying. But this was a very unique moment. In Malaysia, for example, Mahathir, who just earlier, and he was quoted in the Washington Post, saying that he was not opposed to the removal of Saddam as long as the people of Iraq were not hurt. When he saw these demonstrations, and as did people in Egypt and Turkey, the regimes in Egypt and Turkey, they realized that the distance between the regime and the mass of people was widening. So they took a different view. The Turkish parliament passed a resolution opposing the US pressure of sending troops. In India, for 2 months, the US put pressure on our then Prime Minister Vajpayee, to send they wanted 15,000 Indian stabilizing troops to go to Iraq. Part of the coalition government was for this. Several journalists were pleading that we should go along with the US, but the Prime Minister got a sense of this feeling amongst people and said no. And the Indian Parliament passed a very strong resolution against Iraq. The similar thing happened in Malaysia. So what I want to say is that the lesson really was that in the South, in some places, this protest and the response continued. And I want to give 2 examples before I conclude. One was a people's tribunal organized with the European civil society and peace movements in Turkey, which went on between 2003 and 2005. And of course, it came to the conclusion which showed the illegality of this war and indicted Bush and Blair. But the second tribunal, the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Commission and Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal, was actually pushed in 2011, that many years after the war, and supported by the same former Prime Minister, Mahathir. He was a moving force behind this tribunal. And of course, the mainstream media in West, East, North, South called it a kangaroo court, etc. But it again showed the illegality of this war and was excellent in its conclusion. So what these mass movements enabled was, one, that these movements could take place even in a politically unfavorable environment. Second, while the peace movements are weak in compared to the religious and social movements in the global south, these still have the capacity to impact regimes when they show the gap between people and the regime. Third, this really reinforced the collective imaginary of the US-led collective West, even though Belgium and Germany opposed this war. But nonetheless, people here, amongst a mass of people, they have lost faith in the human rights discourse of the West and of liberal democracy. And they believe it's a cover for regime change, because this pattern of Iraq, as shown by many of the speakers earlier, is a pattern. There is a method in this madness of demonization, of false allegations, and the war machine behind it for oil or commodities, etc. And the other thing that these two tribunals did was that they decentered international law. They popularized it amongst people, because the results of the tribunal again trickled down to local populations. So finally, I believe that this war especially has been an input into the positions that the global south has spontaneously taken on the Ukraine-Russia conflict, in which all of them, without any center or structure, have opted for neutrality, and they oppose unilateral sanctions. So even though they have their own wars, many of the regimes are militarist. There are more internal conflicts here than anywhere else. But nonetheless, when they've seen the violence which is put and used by the West on the South, this has been very humiliating and a very sad experience for the global South, and they have responded in these different ways. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you. Thank all three of you for extremely thoughtful comments. I'm afraid we don't have a lot of time, but I do want to ask one question, and hopefully each of you will be able to respond a little shorter than the first round of comments, if you can. And this is what I want to put to you. As we all know, in 20 years since February 15, 2003, the world has changed quite a bit. Not always for the better, to put it mildly. Today, in addition to the expansion of militarism, not only in these overt, horrendous wars, but certainly in our country, in the US, in every aspect of life, militarism has deepened and strengthened its hold. Running right alongside of that is a global struggle that I think we have to acknowledge, and that is our hopefully more and more unified struggle against fascism, or the reemergence of fascism in this moment in history. It may look different than it did in the run-up and during World War II, but it is fascism. So how can we draw lessons or pull out anything that the experience of February 15, 20 years ago gives us to deal with the new realities? What about that moment in history 20 years ago, when so much of the energy of the planet was aimed at trying to prevent the US and Great Britain and the other allies from going to war? And the positive sense, the sense of hope and possibility that our movement had, what about that moment might be useful as we look at the complex and challenging reality of the world we live in today? I know that's a big question, a big set of questions, but if each of you could take 2 minutes and try and answer that, that would be terrific, or shed some light on that. So let's start again with you, Renner.
The Iraq War was the end of the unitarianism superpower United States of America. And we are now, even when we are in a very difficult and dangerous situation, in a situation where the way is open to come to a new multipolar world. A new multipolar world where the power of the traditional Western colonial states is over. And this creates for me a new chance for the development of human beings. And this chance means that the global South will have much more impact and influence in the international politics, and hopefully will help developing these in a direction of ending the wars, more negotiation, more coming to a politics of common security, more taking care of the environment, and hopefully, and this is my last hope, also in the direction of more democracy, even when I see that this will be a biggest problem for the future. So in the dangerous situation of today, there's also a little bit hope for more creative common security future of the world.
Great, thank you. Chair.
Thanks. A very long question, and a 2-minute answer is a bit difficult. I'll give it a go. First of all, the global movement that we managed to assemble in 2003 hasn't gone away. There is a whole network of people that simply didn't exist before. Technology has moved on massively. A meeting such as we're holding now would have been impossible 20 years ago. We'd have been restricted to, at the best, a conference phone call, and even that would have been quite complicated to arrange and probably quite expensive to arrange. So technology has moved on, and that means with it our ability to communicate. And sadly, many of us live in a silo. We live in a self-generating silo of social media where we talk to people we agree with people we talk to. Our news is carefully chosen for us by algorithms by the major news corporations. We've got to think very seriously about the power of the media to influence opinion, to set the standards of debate or not set the standards of debate, and also to simply not report what is going on. And so that does mean the growth of independent media, genuinely independent media, is very, very important. Your point about militarism, Leslie, is absolutely correct. In the run-up to any war, I'm thinking back, Vietnam, the Gulf War in 1991, and so on. All of them were accompanied by lots and lots of pro-war war movies, lots and lots of reporting about the glamour of going to war, the glamour of fighter jets, the glamour of high-tech weapons, the glamour of the apparent safety of Western's military personnel as opposed to those in other countries. And with it develops a whole sort of racism towards the poorest people in the poorest countries. So I asked myself this question, it's a hard one. The Ukraine war gets wall-to-wall coverage on the media in Germany, in France, in Britain, all over Western Europe, and I would imagine all over the USA as well. The equivalent war in the Yemen gets almost no coverage whatsoever. The war that's going on in the Congo, that's taken the lives of hundreds of thousands of people over the past 20 years, doesn't figure on any media. The continuing conflict in Syria comes and goes, but they're reporting more about the earthquake than the conflict, likewise Libya and so many other places. And then when some of us joined in a big protest last year in Liverpool against the arms fair that took place there, we were condemned as damaging British jobs. Whereas we countered by saying, well, actually, we're not trying to damage anybody's job. What we're trying to do is make sure those skills are put to better use, making things that are socially useful. dealing with the environmental disaster we're in. So it is also about the peace movement engaging with all the other debates and arguments in society on wages and poverty levels. And I'll finish on this. So in the Peace and Justice Project, where we've got many thousands of supporters and people helping us do stuff online, we're challenging media, but we're also in the process of putting a book together, which will be published later this year, which is a series of voices around the world on the power of the arms trade and the arms lobby, which, for example, funds the arms trade to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia then buys all these weapons from the British arms industry and uses them to bomb Yemen, as does the UAE, as does Israel in the bombing of Palestine, and so on. And so it is about challenging those fundamentals. But let's not look back with nostalgia at 2003. Wonderful day that it was. And I went the following day to San Francisco to speak at a rally there. That was on February the 16th with Joan Baez, Bonnie Raitt, and a whole lot of other people. It was an amazing occasion. We didn't stop the war, but we did light that light of inspiration in a whole generation of people in exactly the same way that Black Lives Matters lit that light bulb moment in people all over the world who started to question colonial history, question the brutality of colonialism, and question the brutality of war.
Thank you. And Newt.
Yes, well, thank you. This has become easier for me because I agree with everything that Rainer and Jeremy just said, so I have very little to add, except to say, yes, militarism has deepened all over, even the global south. I mean, India has the worst nuclear weapons, the entire subcontinent, Pakistan, and now you're going to see Japan, which is going to abandon its peace constitution. The Philippines is going to have 4 more bases, you know, after all even despite all these protests. South Korea, you know, is exploding. So militarism has really deepened, and I really also think it's linked to this zero-sum mindset. People are not linking it with the climate catastrophe. I see people in green parties, in labor parties, who talk about the climate, but they support, you know, security, and everything is based on the threat perception. And this threat perception does not necessarily have anything to do with reality. So this threat perception, which is being built up against China, it doesn't match with the reality of China's rise. China ultimately is a third world country. It is a country with a century of colonialism and humiliation, as they call it. And of course, they're militarist, and they have the capacity. But as Rainer said, and they do talk of collective, and they've even used the words common security, common global development. So really, people need to talk to each other. And as Jeremy has said, this intersection and interlinking of different movements, because in each of these movements are also siloized, if I say so. You know, if there is a climate catastrophe, you'll have a great climate movement. In India, you had a great farmers movement. It was just unimaginable, you know, sitting in these kind of political circumstances, which is almost a surveillance state at the moment. But still, they got their way. They were able to challenge the corporatization of agriculture. So, but they haven't spoken on peace. So we really need to, I think, link up with these social movements. And the global south also is very fragmented, and they're coming under pressure. One by one, the delegations from the United States, yesterday, for example, they went to a small country like Bangladesh and said, we're going to sanction you. You don't let the 69 ships from Russia who were coming with commodities come in, and they were turned back. Syria, it's in the worst disaster, but it's under sanctions. How can you accept such things. So really we have to speak out against all these things and connect. And the only way out is, I believe, and it is happening, alternate media. A lot of people are not seeing mainstream media, they just see YouTube. So there is that hope. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. Obviously, we have, I think, successfully opened up many, many more questions that need to be addressed. Unfortunately, our time, we're over time, is up. But I hope those of you listening have taken note of what you've heard here. And in the earlier part of this event, that you will ponder these questions, not only in your own mind, but in alliances with other people, through the working relationships that we have with other people in our own cities, in our own countries, and internationally. That's where the answers will come. Through the common work that we do. So there's a lot more to say, but I'm going to wrap this up and turn it back over to Sean. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you, Raina, Jeremy, and Anu. Truly very insightful roundtable, and as it's been said, we wish we had more time. Due to the time constraints of our program today, we have a lot of questions in the question and answer, and we thank you and ask you please to continue to do so. We will not have an open question and answer session during today's program. However, we encourage all the speakers for the rest of the program to look through these questions, reflect on them, and hopefully answer what they are able to in part 2 of our program. And just to add on to that, we are now coming to the end of part 1 of the program. We will have now half an hour break until 1/4 past the next hour in your time zone here in Central European time. That is 6:15 p.m. But that's half an hour from now. So we will have a break, and when we return, we will have considerations from Noam Chomsky to start us off, 20 minutes, explaining a bit more through the history up till the present moment. And then we will go to our final round table, which will include a wide range of voices. So far, many of those we have heard from were present 20 years ago, but it has also been mentioned that young people need to be included in the conversation. So we have made sure to include many younger voices as well in that round table. So we ask you to use the time now to, if you need to grab something to eat or drink, or just rest up. And then in 30 minutes, we will resume the call here. And we look forward to continuing the conversation then. Thank you.